Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Melanin Margin. I'm your host, Quaviondre Williams.
And I'm Daquon Wilson.
And this is the talk show dedicated to bringing the marginalized to the spotlight and uplift the Black voices that will no longer stay silent. So let's get into this week's race conversation. There has definitely been an upward spike in the BIPOC movement in Hollywood these past few years, and this has sparked much controversy in how inclusivity should work in television and film. Now, one of the main issues we see surrounding this conversation is whether or not stories surrounding people of color should revolve solely around their culture or what their culture has to offer. Now, Daquan, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that it's definitely a good conversation to have, and there's a lot of nuance to it, but my immediate answer is like no. Like I think that when it comes to our stories, like stories that are based on somebody's culture, yes, I want that to be shared. Yes, I want to be able to see my culture represented on the big screen. But I also think that relying solely on those stories can get a little tiring because it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like picking at somebody's culture, especially when it's people who are outside of the culture making those stories. And so, there's just some times when I want, like this story about love about Black gay people. And it's just that you don't have to get into like the Black community and how they get along with gay people. You don't have to get to like coming out trauma and all of that stuff. Like how powerful it is just to see a normal story, but having your representation there. I think that's so powerful and something that needs to happen more.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that I've seen it oftentimes where, like, we'll see the Mulans or the Pocahontas or the Princess and the Frog. And, a lot of the time these movies, are so deeply rooted in the culture, which is great. We all want to make sure that we showcase those cultures. But, like, when you look at, stories like Cinderella or Snow White or, this sort of Beauty and the Beast and stuff like that, like it's not so rooted in that culture as much as it is rooted in the storytelling. And I think that
Mhm.
sometimes that over reliance on the culture of the community versus just the community as a whole can sometimes feel like laziness. You know what I'm saying? Because if we look at specifically the Princess and the Frog, and we look at that storyline, and we look at the fact that it's based in New Orleans and the voodoo magic part of the culture, it's kind of like it really does feel like they are trying to use what they feel like is the most entertaining element. Because I think I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it if it was more like, okay, this is other aspects of the culture just littered through the movie, right? But when we look at Pocahontas and we look at Mulan, and it's like we see the dragons and we see the armies and the da-da-das and all that good stuff. And Pocahontas, we see the colors of the wind, and we see like nature talking and moving with her and stuff like that. And it's kind of like, while that is an aspect of some Native American cultures, that's not all that their culture is. You know what I'm saying? Like it's
Right.
not just, it feels very like cherry picking, like the most
Mhm.
entertaining element of it while not letting it just exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and honestly, that's a slap in the face. That's like your culture only has worth when we can make it entertaining. Your culture
Yeah.
only has worth when we can make some profit from it. And like that's disrespectful to the people who culture it comes from. And I think that more and more we need to be able to like have Black stories that are Black stories. Like I think about a lot of 90s sitcoms where you would see, Black people just existing. Yeah, there were a lot of different like racial connotations, and you got deep into like Black culture and different things and the nuances of that. But when you think about shows like Living Single and The Parkers, like at the core of it, it was a Black people existing. Yeah, you can
Mm-hmm.
look back now and like have different types of critiques and stuff like that, but that is something that I feel like we need to revisit once more.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of nuance there because, like, we talked about this before on the show about like having shows that have nuance, or movies that have nuance in them. Because I think that oftentimes, once again, it feels like they're using the quote unquote best elements of the culture as a crutch versus, you know, giving it, telling a good story. And I think that, like you said before, it does kind of feel problematic when it's like, okay, we're only seeing what's exciting about it, like, ooh, voodoo magic. And even in those stories, there are so many problematic elements, like the fact that in Princess and the Frog, like Mama Odie is essentially the mammy minstrel, and they're showcasing voodoo culture as a practice and not a religion, because it's a whole faith system, and it just focuses on the dark elements to it. And that's also another conversation altogether, about how voodoo is seen, or voodoo religion is seen, as something that works with the devil or evil, when the devil doesn't even exist in the voodoo religion. There are Bokors and people who work with darker spirits, but like, there's a lot of this Christian ideology put on it that showcases any other kind of religion or any other kind of facism as kind of a darker one, especially ones that come from African Americans. And so when we look at, the Princess and the Frog, and we see that kind of like the idea that, yes, Mama Odie is a good character, but she is falling into the mammy stereotype. And then we look at, Mulan, and everybody's like, Mushu was an incredibly racist character. In the Asian community, we're talking about that. And Pocahontas talking about the story was not actually accurate to what actually happened, and her ending up with a white man. And it's just like there are so many different levels of, racism embedded in that, because again, some of these stories are not, there are not enough people within that community, within those spaces, to let people know, hey, I get that you're writing the story about us, but understand there's a lot more nuance to our culture there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that it's one of those things where it's kind of disappointing that there's like this tokenism when it comes to it. Like you were saying before, it's cherry picking different parts of it. And it's like, now it's like, oh, here's Mulan. We have Asian representation now. Here's Tiana. We have Black representation now. And yet still it's like, there are so many different expressions of Asian culture. Like, it's not just East Asians. There's Southeast Asians. There's so many different types of people who are of Asian descent. There are so many different types of people who are from Black and African descent. And so when you have this tokenism where it's just like cherry picking one experience, one part of the culture, you are then erasing the rest of it, or telling the rest of the culture that it's somehow lesser.
Yeah, and I think that there's even another layer to that, and the fact that, like, in this situation, when people are creating these stories, oftentimes that's the only story they'll create. Have you noticed that too? Like, when we see these kind of Disney princess stories or whatever, there is multiple different versions of a white princess. We've got Brave, with her being, in the Nordic tribes, or whatever the case may be, in the, Norwegian, whatever, or wherever. I think it's like, I don't know what it is. It's some Viking. I don't know. But like, she has her story is not just around her being a Viking. It's not just about being that aspect of it. We see Snow White, we see Cinderella, we see Beauty and the Beast, we see, Belle. There are so many different variations in white Disney princesses. But when we see like Princess Tiana, she's the only Black princess, and still is the only Black princess now. We have a Asian princess, yes, or unofficial. She's unofficially an Asian princess, because Mulan is not a princess per se, but like that's even the fact that there isn't an Asian princess officially. Like there's a lot of times what will happen is Disney or these major companies will create these TV shows that center around a specific aspect of a culture, and they're like, this is all that we're going to show. That's it. And it's like, I think that what I'm trying to get here is that, like, it's not so much a problem that you're creating the story that revolves around the culture. It's the fact that you're only basing it in that culture, and that's the only story that you're telling. Like, let's go back to the Brave example. Like in Brave, it may be a little bit more embedded in Viking culture, right? But we also have Snow White. We also have Cinderella. We also have, all these other white princesses that showcase different, just living life and being a princess, right? Or becoming a princess. But it's not about, Snow White isn't about German culture, and Beauty and the Beast is not about whatever. But Brave was specifically about Viking culture. So like the fact that we don't have, nothing's wrong with Princess. There is a couple things wrong with Princess and the Frog, but as far as there's nothing wrong with having Princess and the Frog being a story told from a Black perspective, and the New Orleans, gumbo, whatever. But the fact that she's still the only one we have is a problem. The fact that in Mulan, all we see is that, oh, China fighting martial arts, which I think is another conversation too, because if you notice too, a lot of Asian representation, again, me and Daquon are not Asian, but I do feel like we have seen some of these things and we can notice some things about that. The fact that in a lot of Asian movies, TV shows, and films that are in America, that are American based, it only focuses on Kung Fu. It's some kind of martial arts thing. And I mean, you can count on maybe one or two, maybe one hand, the amount of Asian movies that don't involve martial arts. If you can even think of one that doesn't involve martial arts. I don't think I can. Can you, Daquan?
Yeah, I
Maybe
was
Crazy
like
Rich Asians,
having a
maybe?
conversation with my friend about this the other day, and we were talking about because they're Asian, they're Chinese, and they were sharing like the story of how their parents met, and we were
Mm-hmm.
talking about how like you often don't see Asian love stories. Like the only time you see like Asian parents who love each other is like maybe like Crazy Rich Asians or
Yeah.
something like that, but very few representations.
Exactly. And I think that's such a big problem because it's kind of like it's only basing Asian culture in American society seems to be only valid when it has something to do with martial arts. And that's a problem. That's a very significant problem. And I think that, it even moves the conversation even further to the fact that, like, do you think that even though we have moved, because we did see a lot of this happened before where people wanted to highlight people of color, like, as it did in the early 90s, early 2000s, we had like Living Color and Martin, Living Single, Half and Half, the Parkers, Moesha, and so on. But I wanted to ask you, like, do you think we've shifted back to ignoring Black voices, or are we are we going to are we highlighting them more now, or is it just kind of in a weird space? I don't know.
I think it's in a weird space. I think that
Right.
Hollywood is just like that will be like Netflix will be like spotlighting Black voices to like, do something. But again, like that's just tokenism. But I also think that it's a conversation about like who's creating the shows. Like
Yeah.
when I think about, Moesha and the Parkers and all of those shows, like the majority of them, if not all of them, were created by Black people or had like some Black person who was like heavily influenced on that creation team. And I think nowadays, like, yeah, we see Black creators being able to get certain spotlights, but a lot of times when we see representation of people of color in general, they're white showrunners or white creators
Yeah.
who are doing it.
They're the white people are the ones making the final decisions on the final calls on the storylines and stuff like that. Yeah, I think that there's even further going to that. Like, this even brings up another question, like the idea that I think that there should be a quota. I think there should be a certain type of amount, because I feel like if you're writing a show about a culture that you are not privy to or that you don't understand, I think that there should be people in the room from that culture telling you whether or not your story is falling on racist undertones or problematic stereotypes. And I wanted to ask you, like, do you think that do you think that too? Like, do you think there should be a quota of how many people of color are in television shows, even not regarding people of color stories, but do you think there should be a quota of how many people of color should be in television shows, author pools, writers rooms? Like, what do you think?
I think that there should be this idea that there should be representation. I'm not so sure about like the whole quota thing because I think
Yeah.
that in the arts it's a lot more qualitative than quantitative. So like I can
Yeah.
just imagine, production companies abusing that and being like, we're going to take the most like watered down, like conservative Black people we
Oh
know
yeah.
and
Yeah,
put
you're
them in
right.
those pictures. And it's like, you have the representation. We have these Black people,
Yeah.
but it's Black people who all have like the same perspective, the same background, same experiences and stuff like that. So I think that there needs to be some type of wealth of experiences. And I don't think that just having numbers will give that for a show.
Yeah, I think and it's hard because it's kind of like, where do we start? You know what I mean? Because of
Mhm.
course we know that there's definitely that argument of like, people can abuse that, and like, you can, it's like, even though you might have Black people in there, do you have good Black people? You know what I'm saying? Or do you have a whole bunch of Candace Owens and stuff like that? So it's a little like but it's just, I think that there needs to be a starting point somewhere. I think that there definitely needs to be. I definitely do believe that when we're talking about stories about people of color, that people of color should be in the room. I think that's definitely
Yeah.
the first step in that conversation. And while I know that there's a level of quality and stuff like that, you know, at least if we have people of color in those rooms or in those spaces, it'll make it a lot easier for you know, quality people of color to get in those spaces as well. Because, you know, hopefully in our community we can start breaking down those barriers and breaking down, like, showing what homosexuality should look like on television and stuff like that. And so it's such an interesting conversation, but I do think that it does start with opening up that door. I think that it does start with saying, okay, listen, this is a problem and we need to have people of color on the room. Not saying, like, once again, if we look back on that on some other recent stories and stuff like that, like, you know, you want in order to help combat, you know, relying on such negative stereotypes and such negative basically small areas of storytelling. I think that having those people of color in those spaces will help, you know, mitigate some of it. Maybe not fully, you know, correct it. That might take time, but it'll help mitigate some of that fallout that we see.
Right.